the bones or flesh themselves, or are they dating the rocks and the sediment around it? Because I know that one of the things in Genesis that goes with the long ages of certain dates is that we have in the creation narrative a unmarked time between Genesis 1, where you have the creation of the heavens and the earth as a singular event, and then we have the 6 days of creation, which revisit this unformed earth and the potential of older, earlier sediment that may have existed for however long that is encapsulating these fossils that can reflect an old age of the sediment, but not necessarily an old age of the animal or the life in question. So what's being tested in the radiometric data?
Those are good questions, and there's I'll divide that into kind of two topics. The first one, are you dating the actual fossils? Well, there's radiometric dates has a number of different methods in it. Carbon-14 is just one of those methods, and it's different from all the others. Carbon-14 is only useful for dating things at the top of the geologic column. And that one, it uses, you're dating carbon, and so you can only date fossils, wood, bone, this kind of thing. You can't date rocks with that. And that's only good for, on the standard time scale, say 50,000 years or so. All the other methods are different. They cannot be used to date fossils. They only are used to date rock, especially volcanic rock. And so what they have to do is if you want to know the age of this fossil, you find volcanic layers above it or below it or both. You date those layers, and then you assume the fossil is about the same age. Okay, and then you have other things you said are dealing with a question that's a big question among a lot of Christians. What Genesis 1? Okay, is it talking about an old universe and then the creation of our life on this earth, or well? And what happens is that evangelical Protestants generally all believe that the whole universe is only 6,000 years old. So it was all created in the first day of our creation week. Some of the Adventists tend to disagree with that for a couple of reasons. The Genesis 1 there, the way it's worded is very compatible. It's compatible with either the earth is very young or that the universe is very old and the earth is young. So what happened at creation week? Was there a universe already here for millions of years before our 7-day creation week? And to us, that fits better with several things, including the great controversy. If everybody and everything in the universe was created on day 1 of creation week, when did Satan's rebellion happen? In the next 2 or 3 days after that? That doesn't seem to make sense. It fits better with the idea that the universe was here for long ages before. And then, during that time, Satan at some point rebelled, and then God created life on our earth. He prepared our earth for life and created life. So those are two very different perspectives, which we argue about. Well, actually, we don't bother to argue, but we differ on those things.
Thank you.
Okay, my questions are not going to be as in-depth as these other questions. Mine is just more of a personal for you, and then another with about fossils. I just wanted to know first, with dinosaurs, why do they use dinosaurs so much? Is it because they're bigger? That's one. And then also for myself to just know, did you always have this passion to learn about this, or have you always wanted to know how this works and delve deeper to help with your ministry or with your teaching?
Okay, as far as personal, I grew up in an Adventist home for reasons that I don't really understand now. I, I, I didn't take it seriously until I was probably in my mid-20s. I always sort of knew the Bible's right and I'm going to be an Adventist, but it didn't become real for me until later. And then, and even before I really became converted, I had interest in creation. I wondered what it was all about. But it didn't become a focus of my life until after I was in graduate school. And then I realized there are a lot of interesting questions I like to study, I like to go into. And let me see, what was the other part of your question? Oh, dinosaurs. Why are they so famous? Well, that's a good question. There isn't anything about dinosaurs that's special, really. They are just huge and fascinating. And you know, I think this has caught the public's attention, and that's why they are so famous. They're a very small part of the fossil record. And the other things are just as interesting, but they just haven't caught the public's attention. You might be interested to know that one of the richest dinosaur quarries in the world is in Wyoming and is operated by Seventh-day Adventists. There's a group from Southwestern Adventist University and a lot of other volunteers, including other Christians, who have been running this quarry for 30 years. They found probably 40,000 dinosaur bones. And they're all in a museum at Southwestern Adventist University. And some very prominent paleontologists have been there and said, no, this is the best organized career museum we've ever seen. So, and they developed some new techniques for collecting out of quarries that are better than what anybody else uses. So, and any of you could go there and work as a volunteer if you want. They run this quarry every June, every year. There are people, including Adventists, who don't believe that dinosaurs were real. I'm not sure why that is true. But one thing they say, well, why aren't they mentioned in the Bible? The answer to that is, why would they be? If you read the first chapters of Genesis, it talks about creation and sin and about how evil people became, and then there's the flood. It really doesn't describe the ancient world before the flood. And so there's really no reason why it should talk about dinosaurs. But dinosaurs are very real. There's no question about that.
I'll get it to you. I was going to say, go ahead and read the book of Job, Leviathan and Behemoth, but, you know, that's my...
Yeah.
I had a question on, earlier this morning, you mentioned the assumptions and the assumption following those who decided to go with Darwin's work and create the evolution assumption and assuming that creation is wrong. Were there any other widely accepted scientific assumptions during and before the time Darwin's evolution became accepted?
Oh, I'm sure there have always been assumptions, but not such prominent ones. The early centuries after Christ, the Western world generally believed the Bible was true and creation was true. Whether they paid attention to that, that's another issue. But they generally did. And finally, in about, the time of the Enlightenment, 1700s, scholars began to think, we don't want to really hang on to that anymore. So there's to be more and more thinking going away from the Bible and trying to come up with our own explanations. And that has changed the whole situation.
Mine is just a comment about the question about dinosaurs. I don't have the answer, so I just wanted to share what my teacher in college, I think I mentioned to you, Dr. Harris, who was a herpetologist, studied amphibians and reptiles, and actually a colleague of Dr. Brand, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
One of his explanations is that back then they were experimental, doing hybrids. And so they possibly did hybrids that created a bigger animal like a dinosaur. But they were also big men then, so it's not necessarily a giant to them as it is to us. That was I wasn't there, so.
Yeah. Well, that's.
But I'm relaying a possible explanation.
Yeah, that's an observation. Reptiles, some of them, they just sort of continue growing as long as they're living. And if they're living for long times before the flood, they could have gotten bigger than we expect. But also, animals have a lot of genetic potential for variation. I think God made animals that way. All these hundreds of varieties of dogs, they haven't always been. God put in dogs genetic variability, so we can select, make big ones, small ones. So how much did this affect dinosaurs? We don't know. Since they have died out at the flood, or and they maybe weren't in the ark, we don't know that either. Animals do change. There are a lot of vicious, large animals on this earth that must not have been that way at creation. So the dinosaurs have changed in ways that somehow made them vicious and mean, apparently. And so that's just a part of what happened between creation and the flood. So it's left us with some very interesting unanswered questions. And in this whole topic, we try to give answers that we can, but we have to realize there are many questions that we don't have answers for. We were not there. We did not see the flood happen. We didn't see any of these things happen. So there are questions we can answer. Other questions, we just have to say we don't know.
Well, this is Tina's take on it. It seems to me if the Bible describes Adam and Eve as being 15 feet high, 15 feet tall, or much, much taller than us today, why shouldn't the dinosaur be larger than what our largest animals are, the elephants and like that? Why shouldn't they be that big? Mm-hmm. Everything was big. Man was big, animals bigger, just like it is now.
Yeah. Well, people who think humans evolved from other primates, they don't have a reason to think they could have been large. But actually, there is interesting evidence that there were people bigger than what we are now. I suspect that's real, and even though the Bible doesn't actually tell us how big they were, there were humans. There are known skeletons, say 9 feet tall or more. This certainly is very feasible that they were quite a bit taller than we are. We haven't found their actual skeletons of 12-foot man, but it's not impossible at all. There's no reason. There are some people who say, well, a human couldn't be 12 feet tall or more, because if you get that tall, you have to be so bulky that you couldn't function. Well, those people who say that, they've never paid attention to the fossil called Baluchotherium. Okay, you haven't heard that word before. Baluchotherium is a fossil related to rhinoceroses. We find them as fossils in Nebraska, and they were at the shoulder. They were 18 feet tall, and then their head went on up from there. They were not huge and bulky. They were more slender than living rhinoceroses. So this idea that you can't be that big, there's no real basis for that.
Sorry, one more question. Do you find a lot of human fossils, or is that different? Because of the flood, only 8 people survived from the flood?
Well, that's a question that we get all the time. Where are the fossil humans? And it's one that we don't have the answer for. This fossil record, it goes layer after layer. It's only in the very uppermost layers that we find fossil humans. But they had to have been alive the beginning of the flood when all these others were laid down. So why aren't they there? Well, we don't know. There are some interesting things we can say. First of all, we know that fossils don't get formed everywhere. Things that are living on high elevations usually don't get fossilized. If they're lower in the valleys where they get covered by floods and things, then they'll get killed at least. And in the flood, you'd expect those to get preserved. But we can say fairly certainly that humans were not living where fossils were forming in the early part of the flood. Otherwise, you'd have their fossils. And but still, why aren't they? Well, were humans just intelligent enough to survive longer and then rot on the surface? There's another interesting thing. There's some evidence that we're finding, that some people are finding, that suggests that the ark didn't just float away immediately at the beginning of the flood. It could have been up at a higher enough elevation that the flood didn't hit it until later. And if that's true, then that would help to explain why humans are not found down here. You know, they rotted and floated away, and the ones after the flood are come up near the top. So those are just some clues, but that's one of the questions that we wonder about. Why aren't there more fossil humans?
Couldn't they have also been eaten by sea life as well? Like,
Oh, I think so. Yeah, there's evidence. There's evidence of a lot of carnivory during the flood.
I mean, I've always wondered too if maybe because there was so many humans, why the Middle East is so oil rich, as you know, because of decomposition. Because isn't a lot of the fossil fuels due to fossils? I mean, so I'm thinking like, you know, maybe because you had so much humans in that particular area, the Middle East and certain parts of, let's say, the coast of South America is rich in, and off the coast of like Nigeria and stuff, is rich in oil. So I've always maybe wondered if that could be a reason why you don't have fossils, because you have the fossil fuel. I don't know.
Oh, I don't know either.
So,
So I don't know how to answer that.
and then the second question is, do you have an alternative theory to the Galapagos Islands? I mean, that's what turned Darwin. He was on the Beagle. He saw the different finches on the, the different islands. And people go there now on trips, on vacations, to see the finches, to see, the theory of evolution in practice, in real life. Is there an alternative theory to why the finches are different?
That whole picture of the Galapagos finches is an interesting story, because for one thing, when Darwin, they call those Darwin's finches, but when Darwin was on those islands, he didn't really pay attention to those finches. He collected a few, and he didn't realize that these could support evolution. It was after he came back to the United States, or rather to England, he saw finches that other people had collected, and they had been more careful to label where they came from. So his theory of the Galapagos finches evolving, that's something that developed way after he was in the Galapagos. He did not see that sort of thing in Galapagos. And those Galapagos finches, they're all in one small group of birds that could very well be one created type that have diverged by microevolution, by small changes. That's probably real. And so it really, there are a lot of stories about how this have influenced Darwin. Those are kind of mythical. The Darwin's finches are real, and they have varied.
I was going to say, weren't you addressing that earlier in the presentation when you were talking about the evidence we have for microevolution? For example, the slight variations in certain canons of proportion of animals or creatures, but macroevolution being the real problem for the evolution theory? Yeah,
macroevolution is the one that is not supported by good evidence, and that's the one that is contrary to the Bible. Now, Interestingly enough, Darwin's book that convinced the world of evolution, it really only dealt with microevolution. In fact, it's the origin of species. That's microevolution. And the Darwin convinced the world of evolution not because he had real evidence for it. He won a psychological victory. The human population, the scholars especially, were thinking more and more away from biblical explanations. And but they had trouble understanding how you get animals without a creator. What Darwin did is he didn't demonstrate that evolution is right. He convinced the biologists that there might be a way to get rid of the creator. And that's why he was so successful. And actually in his book, Origin of Species, he really only dealt with microevolution. He did not deal with macroevolution. And so that's, for him to have convinced the world of evolution is a little bit of an enigma because he didn't produce evidence for that.
I was wondering, would you say that the Cambrian explosion, where we have an introduction of all the various forms of dinosaurs and different fossils in the fossil record, also hurts a macroevolution argument because we don't see the progression of fossils prior to all of the different forms introduced in the kind of uniform sedimentary layer? Because that's one thing that...
That's a very important point. And that's one that the evolutionary thinking scientists struggle over. They argue about it. What do we do with that? Because in the early part of the Cambrian rocks, the Cambrian explosion, all the major phyla are present. And they're not present in primitive kinds of forms. They're very fully well-developed forms of life. And so where did that all come from? That's a big puzzle, and like I say, there's arguments among scientists about what to do with that. And they have to somehow believe that evolution is true, because that's what they've chosen, even though that's a problem for them. A few years ago, I was at the Geological Society of America meetings, which I attended every year for many years, and they had in that session, they had some talks by evolutionists, biologists, who said there has to be, before this Cambrian explosion, there had to have been 500 million years of evolution before the Cambrian explosion, in order to explain life. There has to be. That was what they said. And at noon, they had a session they sometimes called Hot Topics at Noon. They would bring in controversial things that were being discussed. And so they had a couple of those biologists saying you have to have 600 million years of evolution, and then the paleontologists who know there's no fossils, talking about there's no fossils during that time. And so they never came to a resolution of that. And during the discussion, there was one incident that happened that intrigues me to this day. There's a gentleman sitting just ahead of me, some kind of geologist or paleontologist, and he stood up and he said, "Now you're telling us that there had to have been 600 million years of evolution, and yet we're being told there are no fossils during that time." And then he, with some emotion, he said, "Why are we avoiding the real question?" And he sat down. So I wish I could have talked to him about what he saw as the real question. I think the real question is, this doesn't fit evolution. If you've committed to throwing out the Bible and believing that life evolved, you have to accept that even if the evidence is a problem.
I want to thank Dr. Brand for this afternoon presentation. And thank you all for coming out and supporting the Origin Seminar. And look forward to next week. In the bulletin, we have each of the sessions outlined there for you. And so I encourage you to participate next week as well. For those who, for some reason, aren't able to attend, you can also go online. You can go to YouTube, and these are all streamed, so you can catch up. But again, thank you all for coming, and we'll close out with a word of prayer. Merciful Lord and Almighty God, Creator, we thank you for our existence and for the plan of salvation and for your wisdom. And we thank you for the Bible, the Scripture, and for the scientific discoveries that have been made and the evidence that has been revealed supporting the creation story.